Okay, we are live. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Sasquatch Out of the Shadows. I'm your host, Alex Pedikov. We have our really awesome guest on tonight. We have my friend Seth Breedlove of Small Town Monsters. He's going to be joining us shortly. Just going to go over a couple quick things before we bring Seth in. First of all, I just want to say thank you to everyone. We just hit 5,000 subscribers last night, which is pretty great. I never really expected that to happen. But thank you guys all for the support. Really appreciate it. And on that theme, I just posted a new video this past Friday called The Boggy Creek Monster, The Monster of Boggy Creek. You can check that out on the channel. It's just a short documentary talking about my time exploring the Fouke, Arkansas area last year. So you can check that out on the channel, like I said. We're going to have a couple more interviews and videos coming up shortly as well, sort of related to that that topic, so should be pretty cool to check out. For upcoming guests, we have next week Sean Forker's coming on. Sean is a Fortean researcher. He's researched a lot of things in the state of Pennsylvania, so that's pretty interesting. After that, we have Les Odell, Michelle Soleri, Carrick St. Laurent, Steve Coles, Cliff Barrickman, Jonathan Wilk. There's a lot of cool guests coming up in the next couple of months here. So I pretty much have it packed up through to the end of the summer and starting a little bit into the fall and into September. So hope you guys will stay excited for that. Next, just want to talk about Pedikov Media, my website. If you head over there, you can check out my latest project called Lions of the East, which is a documentary about mountain lions and mystery big cats in New England. I'm not sure I've really mentioned that on the show, maybe just in passing, but that's a sort of separate, completely venture to Sasquatch-related documentary. So that's more of a long-form documentary talking about mountain lions in the New England area and those sorts of things. So feel free to check that out. You can get digital copies on my website, and there's other documentaries and things on there as well. That's on pedikovmedia.com. And lastly, I just wanted to mention Chasing Legends. So this is a project I've joined on with Nash Hoover, who's a young guy like myself, documentary filmmaker, interested in the unknown, lots of cryptid mysteries and that sort of stuff. And he's got a program called Chasing Legends, where him and his crew basically go around to different parts of the country and explore and look for cryptid legends and really kind of investigate that in a sort of hands-on approach. So I've joined on with them. We filmed an episode here in New England right before the whole pandemic situation and the lockdown started. So that was really fun. So we're teaming up. We're going to be launching a Kickstarter for that on May 26th, so at the end of this month. So if anyone's interested in that kind of stuff, there will be a link to Chasing Legends website down in the description of this video. So as I mentioned, it's going to be various cryptid legends across the country. So we're hoping to, when this situation calms down, begin going around and exploring and filming some of these mysteries. And as I said, we already have one in the bag. That's I won't mention what it is, but I'll say it is here in the New England area. So without further ado, we have Seth, who's going to be joining us in a minute here. So just a quick intro on him. Seth is a great guy. He's a friend of mine. He's done documentaries on, all kinds of cryptids and myths and the entire subject of Bigfoot and UFOs and the On the Trail of series. I've had the pleasure of working with him on various projects. So he has definitely covered a lot of ground in a pretty short amount of time. Lots of you have probably seen his Boggy Creek documentary, the Mothman, Terror in the Skies, about Thunderbirds, the Beast of Bray Road. The list goes on, and it kind of goes at a never-ending pace. So we have Seth joining us now. So without further ado, we're going to bring Seth in. Hey, Seth, how you doing, man?
Good. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you good.
Okay.
If you guys can hear us both, just put a thumbs up in the comments. I hope you guys can hear me. Otherwise, I've just been talking to a blank screen for the past 7 minutes or so.
Yeah. I'm in my office, which looks like a tornado hit it.
Oh, we got the matching shirts going on here.
I saw that as soon as I got in here, but yeah,
that was not planned, folks. I swear.
I had my 3-year-old at the office last week, and it just becomes like a tornado in here.
Tommy is a tornado in the office. Yeah, it checks out. Yeah, I was trying to figure out a shirt. I'm like, which one do I go with? Because I have so many of the Small Town Monster shirts. I'm like, Mothman. I feel like I wore that one already. I'll go with the Momo because it's probably my favorite. Honestly, it just looks so cool.
I think it's my favorite. I like the color. Yeah, the
I
color.
just love the artwork that was done for it too. Sam, obviously, Sharon does an amazing job on that.
Yeah.
So if you guys haven't seen Momo, that's a really good one to check out, Momo the Missouri Monster. But without, before we get into some of the stuff, for maybe somebody that hasn't heard of you or Small Town Monsters, do you want to give them like a quick rundown? I sort of gave it, but I want it from your perspective.
Those people don't exist.
Yeah.
No. Small Town Monsters is an independent film series that focuses on rural monster cases around the United States and how they affect the communities where they take place. At least, like that's how it started, and then it morphed into whatever it is today. I mean, it's basically Small Town Monsters at this point is an independent production company that makes movies and episodic series relating to cryptids and the paranormal, I guess is the easiest way of saying it at this point. And you've worked for us / with us, so
Yeah.
so you're a part of the crew.
Yeah, and it's a wonderful crew, and there's so many awesome people associated with it. Obviously, you guys in Ohio, and then Brandon and in LA, and lots of people. I mean, across the country at this point, you've got a network of really talented people who work on this stuff.
Yeah, I think like Shannon. I kind of consider Shannon part of the crew, and
Yeah, definitely.
she's in Las Vegas. We got Adam down in Tennessee. It's spreading out too. Like it seems like every year it gets a little bigger.
So Small Town Monsters gang. That's kind of the what we're going to go for at this point.
Yeah,
Setting up chapters as far wide as we can.
That's the goal. Yeah.
Awesome. So obviously I mentioned a little bit about some of the documentaries you've done. Do you want to just talk a little bit about Minerva Monster? That's the seminal piece. That's kind of the thing you guys started out with. Do you want to mention a little bit about how, because I like the history of how you kind of got into that. You grew up with the story. Do you want to expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, Minerva was the Minerva Monster story was the first sort of like local Bigfoot case I was aware of, and I was aware of that story as a kid. I used to have this friend, Gary, who used to come over to hang out on like the weekends and stuff. And I can remember one time we were randomly just like driving around in the middle of nowhere down near Bolivar, and he made some joke about the Minerva Monster coming out and getting us, or something like that. And so that was the first time where I can remember like really being aware of the Minerva Monster. But I mean, the Minerva Monster story relates to this family who during August of 1978 were frequently citing this 7-foot tall, hair covered creature on the hill behind their house. And it kind of culminated in August of 1978 when the said creature came down off the hill and like approached their house, and it freaked them out. They all ran inside. They were outside having a party. They all ran into the house, and this was a lot of people, by the way. Like that's one piece of this that gets overlooked, is how many corroborating witnesses there are to the Minerva story. Like even the more like bizarre stories have many corroborating witnesses. So the whole family like go inside, and the monster actually approached their house. They were in the kitchen. It actually came right up to the window and put its hands up on the house. Mrs. Caton, the matriarch of the family, had a rifle, pointed it at the creature, and the creature kind of stepped back with its hands up, put its hands down, turned around, and walked back up the hill. So they called the police. The police arrived a short time later, headed up by a police chief who was just a deputy sheriff at the time named James Shannon. He came out. The first thing they noticed was that there was a very strong ammonia smell in the area. They went to where the family said they saw the creature. go up the hill, and they did find like what was clearly some sort of like game trail or animal trail going down into this pit and then up this hill. And that's sort of like, that's the story that got that pushed that whole thing into the public eye. I mean, there was so much prior to that. Like the family was feeding this thing. That gets kind of left out a lot. They for months prior to the August,
Right.
they were throwing scraps and stuff in the pit because they were seeing it. So the way the house is set up is kind of important too, geographically. Like if you see our movie, you get a pretty good lay of the land there at their house. But there's something very important in front of the house, and there's something very important behind the house. So in front of the house is the Lincoln Highway, which is a major highway that stretches from coast to coast. It starts in New York City and it ends in San Francisco. And I've actually been on at the both ends of the spectrum of the highway, which is kind of cool. But it's a coast to coast highway, and it's a lot of people connect high strangeness with this highway too. Like if you look across the country, there's a lot of these weird incidents all along the highway. In fact, we've investigated other stories that involve the Lincoln Highway. It just never really gets mentioned in the movies. And now that I said that, I can't really immediately call them to mind, but I've realized before that we've done other movies in close proximity to the Lincoln Highway. The Chestnut Ridge runs through that area too.
Yeah.
Not the Chestnut Ridge runs through the area. The highway runs through the Chestnut Ridge.
Right.
Anyway, so there was a lot going on around there at the time, and that story got picked up by local media. The local media started covering the Minerva Monster case, and before you knew it, it was kind of like a global phenomenon. There were stories on the Minerva Monster coast to coast and around the country and around the world. So it became a really big deal for a very, very short period of time, and then was pretty much largely forgotten until we made our movie in 2015. There were investigations into the Minerva Monster after that. I shouldn't act like we brought it back from the dead. I mean,
there's like local news pieces or something like that.
No, I mean, there were a couple local news pieces, but more than that, in the like late 70s, like not late 70s, very early 80s, Robert W. Morgan did a lot of investigating into that case because Morgan grew up in Canton, Ohio. He weirdly dated my aunt. There's some family connection to Robert W. Morgan, and then Don Keating looked into that case as well, and Ron Schaffner and some of these guys, some of these like local Ohio Bigfoot legends.
Right. Because I was going to say, I mean, Ohio is obviously a state where there's been, at least for the past 40 years, pretty well known for Bigfoot. So this is just one Bigfoot case in Ohio, but is it because there's some of the weirder elements that kind of it stood out, or do you think it was just because it took place during that sort of late 70s high strangeness? I mean, it had a competition with a lot of other weird stories across the country.
Yeah, I think it's the most popular Ohio case, Ohio cryptid case. Like even more so than like the Loveland Frog and stuff like that. Right. But it was definitely competing with like Old Orange Eyes, which is a Mansfield-based. Old Orange Eyes is basically just an urban legend, but there is another case that's close to Mansfield, near Ashland, Ohio, called they called that creature Big Head.
Yeah,
is not an original name, but Big Head was kind of a cool story too, and involved this like Bigfoot. It was similar to Minerva in that, for one thing, they both took place in the summer of 1978, and then the other is that they both involved a family seeing this creature on multiple occasions. So I don't know what it is about the Minerva case that really took off, other than the fact that the other stories didn't capture the same sort of regional media attention.
Right.
Big Head was competing with Minerva, which had already gone national, if not international, by that
So you can only
point.
have so many stories from Ohio, right? One's got to claim the title, I guess.
That's pretty much it. Well, I think especially because it was in that same summer, and even if you read the stories about Big Head, they're still kind of drawing off of the Minerva Monsters fame. Like
yeah.
I forget what the headlines were on the earliest Big Head stories, but it was something like Minerva isn't the only town with a monster or something like that. You know, it was like it was still kind of. I mean, that regional press is a big deal because what happens is, like, in the case of the Minerva Monster, the regional press happened to be the Canton Repository and the Akron Beacon Journal, which are two of the biggest papers in Ohio, if not the country at that time. Especially the Akron Beacon Journal was pretty huge. So, like, when they started picking up the story, they're both tied to the AP. The AP runs the story, and then all of a sudden it goes coast to coast. And it weirdly enough, I mean, we experienced that 50 years later when we made the movie, and the Akron Beacon Journal did the front page story on us, and then that got picked up by the AP. So, like, you know, I think the popularity of the story was entirely because of the media attention that started locally and then bloomed, you know, across the country.
Yeah, right. That's really actually interesting. I mean, you mentioned the AP. Obviously, that's played a crucial role in even spreading the name of Bigfoot back in the day. Obviously, you know, with the history there in the 1950s. But what do you think about that part of Ohio? Because when I think of Ohio and I think Bigfoot or Sasquatch, that kind of stuff, I usually think, I think a lot of people maybe that aren't from Ohio think southern Ohio, right, where there's a little bit more forest kind of toward West Virginia, Salt Fork kind of stuff. Minerva, when I was there, I think it was one of the first times we met back in 2016, 15,
Yeah.
something like that, for Minerva. So we were actually in Minerva, just driving around. It was interesting. It was just kind of flat little hilly terrain with farms and houses and kind of little patches of woods.
Yeah, it's so Ohio. The way Ohio, to me, is laid out is that Canton, and then to the east of Canton is where you get into that forested Pennsylvania, Appalachia kind of region.
Right.
And so while you're right, there are the hills and the flatland and the farm. It's not Midwestern like where I live now, like Wadsworth. Wadsworth to me is like the gateway. Medina County is the gateway to like Illinois, Indiana style Midwest.
Right.
But if
you're not that far from Cleveland in that area.
Right. But if you head east of where I am, that's where you start getting into the forest. So what you're saying is right. There are like really flat pastureland areas out there, but there's a lot of forest starting right around Minerva. And especially east of Minerva, where you start getting toward, because you're getting real close to the Pennsylvania line from Minerva. From Minerva to PA, you're at around 40 minutes, and from there, from Minerva to like Beaver Creek State Park, which is as squatchy as it gets, in my opinion, like you're 35, 40, 45 minutes, something like that. So in fact, Little Beaver Creek runs right behind the Caton's home. So,
yeah, right.
So,
I remember at Minerva Monster, there was a couple guys that approached me when we were there. Obviously, we did the screenings and everything. A couple people came up and said, "Oh yeah, we live a couple miles from here, and they come to our yard every year," kind of thing. The guy was showing me pictures, and I mean, his backyard, it looked pretty wild, which for me was interesting. I think in New England we have a different perception of what Ohio looks like. People haven't spent too much time there. So having spent a little bit of time over there the past few years, you see actually a lot of those forests are pretty incredible, especially, you know, like you said, in that eastern kind of section. Old growth trees. I mean, those massive trees that you really don't see even in New England because all that stuff was logged. So
yeah,
the habitat, I would say, is pretty conducive for all kinds of bears and other animals. You guys have plenty of those. So.
I mean, that's the thing, is like that area in Minerva, especially the interesting thing about like the forest. So the other really important piece of the Caton's property is behind the house, where you have this hill that was once strip mined, but today is like completely forested, and they're behind their house is this forest, and you could really walk in that forest, get down into the creek, and never leave the woods all the way into PA. Like you could walk all the way to PA and stay in the forest once you're on that hill behind the Caton's house and going. So it's not that forested area isn't broken up by occasional roads or houses, because it's Ohio, so there's people, but it's patchy and dense enough that you could stay pretty well hid if you were a large creature. And I mean, the other thing is, like, I don't put much stock in Salt Fork anymore, but for sure the Cambridge, Woodbury Wildlife, Coshocton, that area down there, that's not far from Minerva. In fact, it's pretty darn close as far as as the crow flies. So you're getting northeastern Ohio is a lot more forested than people think. Like, you get up into some of the areas, even outside of the city. I mean, there's a friggin' national park that sits between Akron and Cleveland that has more Bigfoot reports than any other part of Ohio, and that's amazing. Literally like in a 40-mile stretch of forest that happens to sit in between two of the biggest cities in the state.
Yeah, and it's a beautiful looking area. And forgive me if I butcher the pronunciation. Is it Cuyahoga, or how do you say it?
It's Cuyahoga Valley.
Cuyahoga. Yeah, we've driven by there when we've been. I think last time there was it's September or something like that. We drove through, and I remember seeing the signs, and I was hoping to make it out there when we were going to have the UFOs on the Trail UFOs premiere this past March. Obviously, that didn't happen in April, which is too bad. But it really is some beautiful nature out there. People I think they just don't really. They expect Cleveland, that kind of thing. Sort of like, I guess, how you thought. You guys probably have the perception that New England is all Boston, or it's pretty urban.
My perception of New England was that it was all beach. Like, like, you just hear New England, and in my head, everything's like Portland, Maine, or the Cape Cod or something. Like, that's just like what I thought of when I thought of New England. So
yeah, no, definitely. So I think what we'll do is we'll take some questions as they start coming in. I have some more questions for you, and I want you to talk about a few more things. But we'll take a question actually from my college buddy, Stefan. Mm-hmm. He says, question for Seth. Have you ever looked into the skunk ape cryptid of Florida or the Shunkawarakin of Montana? It's a good question. Yep. Oh, it just disappeared. I was just trying to keep it up there. Yeah.
Cryptid. So I think right now I'm actually doing some research. I can't talk. I think right now I'm doing some research into the skunk ape a little bit more, just because I'd really like to get a Bigfoot movie into the Southern Monsters trilogy. So skunk ape has always been something I wanted to do, especially because the photo, the Mayaka is such an interesting photo. And just the terrain of southern Florida is so friggin' insane. Like, it's like another planet or something down there. And I've always wanted to get down into like the Everglades and stuff like that. And I think it would be such an interesting dichotomy from the rest of the trilogy, the Southern Monsters trilogy. So I'd love to do something about the skunk ape. I just haven't been able to. The problem is, like, for an STM movie, skunk ape would fit in perfect with what I'm doing with On the Trail of Bigfoot. Like, I could definitely, and I probably will at some point, do an On the Trail of Bigfoot skunk ape episode, even if I end up doing a movie. The problem is with the movies, you've got to find like a town. There's got to be a cultural, something that happened culturally, locally at a small town. And so it becomes a little hard to sandwich the parameters for what need to be happening to establish a small town monsters movie into a case that might not have those things involved.
Of course. Whereas I think it would probably be easier in On the Trail of, it's just sort of a part of the larger Bigfoot mystery. It's really interesting, actually. The guy who asked the question, Stefan, he has a place down there not too far from Mayaka. And when we were in college, we went down there for a spring break, and we went to Mayaka State Park. And then, like, the week after we got back, this must have been 2000, 13, 12, something like that. The week after we got back, that was when there was those new photos that came out of the thing that was in the field.
Yeah.
And I was like, man, if we were there a week earlier. But those photos are really incredible. I think it was a show I did with Ken a couple weeks ago where somebody asked the question about the Mayaca photos. I mean, those are still pretty unknown. And if you watch the Monster Quest one, they obviously talk about it a lot. And they have biologists and wildlife experts look at it. But I think the second part of his question was anything on the Shunka Warakin. I mean, I know we all obviously have heard of that a lot in cryptid lore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, there's nothing planned for it yet.
That almost be like a Dogman type thing tie-in. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, right now, what I'm looking at as far as like what I really want to do next is so our problem is that right now we're wrapping, not our problem, I mean, it's not a problem, but we're wrapping up the Southern Monster trilogy. And I say that it's funny, we haven't even released a single movie, but we already know what the first two are. So I'm basically into pre-production on the third movie, which I'm not even sure what it is yet. But we're trying to get through Southern Monsters, and then I had to make a decision on what the next trilogy is, because I've decided we're working in these trilogies. And my dream, like what I really want to do is go west. I want to go out to the southwestern desert, and I want to do like a desert monster trilogy. Realistically, I don't know. First of all, I don't know if we can find 3 stories that fit the STM parameters for our movies. And then second of all, realistically, I don't know if we can afford it, because essentially you would almost have to go out there and shoot all 3 movies over the course of like a week and a half, 2 weeks. Because there's no way we're going to be able to afford to travel back and forth from Ohio to like New Mexico or something, multiple times. So
yeah, that would be tricky.
Oh, and then it's like, and then I got to decide if it's either that or East Coast monsters. I know who my East Coast monsters are already. So like that's lined up. But the problem is I feel like we've spent a lot of time on the East Coast. And one thing I loved about On the Trail of UFOs was getting out of that area and getting out into completely different looking terrain. So
absolutely. I think that the West Coast needs a little small town monsters love.
Yeah.
So here's another question. This is from Jordan Warner. I think you know him as well. He asked, might be a personal question, how does Seth's Christian background influence his view regarding cryptids and the paranormal?
Yeah, I mean, Mark and I talk about this sometimes on STM. I mean, obviously, my Christian background it affects my life, like in general. Right. So you have that, but when it comes to like cryptids and the paranormal, I do not see correlations as much as most people would expect someone who's a professing Christian to see those correlations. I think a lot of people have this like tendency, if they're a Christian, to like immediately say this is like demonic. We hear that. Yeah, we hear a lot of that kind of stuff. Like definitely. It's the Nephilim, or this is demonic, or it's a demon, or it's a possession case or something. And the only time so far of the movies we've made where I felt like the case was presenting information that was leading us from a story standpoint in that direction was Bray Road. And like everything else, I've kind of like, I'm not going to force, because I'm a documentarian, so it's not my, I'm not supposed to be pushing myself and my views into our films. So the only time that we've done something that led us naturally in that direction was with Bray Road. I mean, there's aspects of like the abduction phenomena that sound eerily similar to things you read in the Bible. In fact, Mark mentioned this, and I'm hoping at some point we can get, if we go back to do more On the Trail of UFOs, if we do another abduction episode, I'd like to get into some of the more like folkloric and spiritual aspects of something like a
theological sort of examination. That would be, I think that would be really cool.
Yeah, because Mark talked about correlations between abduction phenomenon and demon possession that I thought were really interesting, which I had also never really heard anyone tie those two things together. And I thought so when it comes to stuff like that, I'm all for it. The biggest thing is when it comes to being a documentarian, I really don't try to force my views and opinions into those, movies. It'd be different if I was appearing on camera, maybe, but and the other thing is I just don't, like Bigfoot, I don't see a correlation or anything that would lead me to believe the Bigfoot subject is somehow spiritual in nature or anything like that. I mean, obviously, if Bigfoot is real, then it's my belief that it was created, and that would be awesome. That's another crazy animal that apparently God threw out there. So I don't know, man. It's a weird, like, I get asked about that fairly often because Mark and I are pretty open about our spiritual beliefs, but I'm very different from the other Christians I talk to who are into this stuff because I just don't connect the two very often.
I think I was just going to mention that. I feel like a lot of that what we see is people that are really trying hard to tie that into that worldview that they have.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even as myself as an Eastern Christian, I mean, I think there's a lot more mysticism perhaps in our version of Christianity than there is in a lot of the Western churches. So for me, it's not even that big of a conflict in terms of some of the stuff that's out there. But I don't know. I mean, if we're talking about UFOs, I feel like that's different than Bigfoot. Obviously,
Sure.
people try to draw connections in more recent times. But if we're talking just chasing animals that are thought to be extinct, I don't really see how that view would affect that as much.
Yeah.
Thanks for answering. It's a good question, and thank you for that question, Jordan.
Yeah.
This is actually, you mentioned Bray Road, so this is a perfect question from Carrick of Crash Course Cryptozoology. I understand Small Town Monsters once did a documentary on the Beast of Bray Road. What are Breedlove's opinions on the entirety of the Dogman phenomenon? I'm going to like this answer.
Yeah, I mean, so one important thing to this is a disclaimer for what I'm about to say. One important thing to note about me is, like, I keep mentioning this, but I'm a documentarian and I'm a filmmaker. So, my personal opinions do not get put into our movies. Occasionally they will seep into On the Trail of, because those are a little more personal, especially On the Trail of Bigfoot, because it's being told from my perspective. But I will not push my views on stuff into our work. So where I, like, kind of how I feel about the Dogman phenomenon is that I think it's a fad in a way. And I'm immediately going to offend people by saying this, but I think I really think it was a fad. And I'm not saying that people aren't seeing things, because we've talked to people who've seen these things and they seem to be honest and they seem to have actually seen something that defies explanation. I also think that there are a number of these sightings that are probably of coy wolves and, like larger than average wolves and things like that as well. And then I think I do think there's an element of something like the Beast of Bray Road that might be rooted in the occult or some sort of, like, more supernatural explanation than cryptids. I've never bought into the idea that Dogman is an undiscovered species of upright walking wolf creatures. It's on the surface, it is absolutely absurd. Now, I'm not saying I haven't talked to people who did put across their views on that and make it seem believable, because I have. Ricky, that we interviewed in Beast of Bray Road, very succinctly and believably explained why his opinion is that they are some sort of, like, undiscovered species of dog wolfman hybrid things. I just have a really hard time buying that. And I'm not writing off the whole thing. I do believe there's something going on here. I mean, you have sightings of Dogman going back for centuries, so those sightings have taken place, and they've taken place around the world, and in America. So
yeah,
those historical accounts, you have to at least leave the door open that something's going on there. And like I said, I do think there's a lot of the Dogman sightings that defy explanation. I just think that what I saw happen is maybe like what you might be able to help me out. Like 4 or 5 years ago, Dogman became the hot cryptid.
Right.
And
A decade ago,
sudden,
nobody was talking about it as much.
Right. And all of a sudden, everyone kind of jumped into that end of the pool, and that's where everyone wants to kind of hang out right now, is talking about Dogman.
Yeah, and that's what's so interesting, and that's something I was going to mention is you have Dogman kind of everywhere. You know, people saying different states, different types of sightings. But you've had stuff like Bray Road, where it's been sort of concentrated local thing. Another one that comes to mind to me is the Rougarou in Louisiana.
Yeah.
And that's obviously tied to French folklore, the Beast of Gévaudan, the classic European werewolf story that would have come over from Europe to North America. Quebec, they have the Wendigo, which in my opinion is very similar to the werewolf sort of story, because it's a story of transformation, a taste of human flesh, that sort of thing. I've at least drawn connections to that in the past, but it's interesting how that does seem to be the fad now. Everyone's on that train, but there is also the kind of the people that say, oh well, maybe it's a type of Bigfoot that has a baboon face. I mean, that's something that I've heard that too.
Yeah, I mean, what the problem with that explanation when it comes to locations where a lot of these things are seen, I would say, like, especially like Michigan and Bray Road, it's once you go to those locations, to me, it's not the least bit believable that there's a Bigfoot hanging out near Elkhorn, Wisconsin, because there's no habitat. There's no place anything an undiscovered ape is going to be able to live and stay hidden in a place like Elkhorn, Wisconsin. And I mean, the Dogman phenomenon too, it seems like you can't escape the weirder aspects of it. They get drawn into it no matter what. So you've got, you know, on Bray Road, you have Lee Hampel and his ranch, where he's, you know, like been documenting all sorts of weird activity beyond just Dogman sightings or Beast of Bray Road sightings. He's got, you know, like the picture that's in the Bray Road Beast of like the mist that came in and like essentially ate that deer, and like all sorts of like really weird, like Skinwalker Ranch style, bizarre, almost poltergeist like phenomena as well. So I don't write off the Dogman stuff. I just think I think there's a lot of hype. I think there's a lot of people that want to be involved in that story. They want to be a player in the story, and so you have to be really careful to you know, make sure you're separating the wheat from the chaff.
Definitely, it's interesting. I mean, I even had just recently the last Granite State Bigfoot lecture I did up here in New Hampshire. I usually have people tell me about their stories of just encountering Bigfoot here. And there's one guy who told me of seeing a kind of reddish haired Sasquatch, but it had almost like a snout looking thing. So I don't know, maybe, I mean, if we're assuming the Bigfoot's real, that's sort of maybe a biological, you know, some people have longer noses. I don't know. That's obviously complete speculation. But moving on here, just address this question real quick, because Guy 15 has a question that I was going to ask you. But hey, Alex and Seth, what's up from Northeast Ohio? Seth, where can we find or get your Small Town Monsters movies? I would like to purchase some of your movies.
Okay, so smalltownmonsters.com.
Link is in the description below, guys.
Yeah. Smalltownmonsters.com, Amazon, Google Play, you know, like all the really popular streaming avenues. You're going to find some of our movies. All of our movies are on Amazon. All of our movies are on Vimeo on demand if you're looking for streaming. I can tell you to keep your eyes on July, because July there's going to be an explosion of Small Town Monsters movies coming out on a ton of different platforms. And I just found that out today. So yeah, it should, they're going to be much more widely available than they are right now.
Awesome. That's, yeah, good news. Just a couple comments before we get to dive into that question. I love Seth's drive-in movie feel he has in his films. Reminds me of Spielberg meets Grindhouse. Thanks, Illuminathan.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, it's funny because I'm doing this like ridiculously in-depth review or interview with Steve Bissett.
Yeah.
And it's clear in doing the interview that Momo is like his high water mark for STN. We're already like 20 emails into this interview, and it's just like we're just talking about Momo, and we aren't even out of talking about those two older guys that are introduced in the documentary like 20 minutes into the movie. So and in doing the point I was making, in doing that interview is like, I guess like in doing the interview and really talking about influences and stuff like that, I guess I didn't realize like Spielberg really is like probably Spielberg and Hitchcock are the two that I'm consistently going back to the most when I'm doing this interview, where he's like asking me, well, what like going into this movie, what were you kind of watching or what were you thinking about? It keeps coming back to like Spielberg and Hitchcock. So yeah, that was a big compliment.
I imagine some of that comes out. Yeah, here's just a quick question. I think this one can be answered pretty shortly. Is Shannon still coming to do on the trail UFOs at the Palace? If mention that real quick.
Well, I mean, as of right now, that event is canceled for 2020. If we do it again, it's going to be 2021. I do want to get Shannon back, and I do want to get Lyle in. We just have to get a weekend nailed down. The problem is all the events that have been canceled are pushing further and further into the year. And the last time I talked to them at the Palace, they were telling me that people were already scheduling into spring of next year. So right. Our problem is going to be just finding a weekend that hasn't already been taken up, by a huge event. So whatever we end up doing, we will get Shannon up here for an event. There will be something that we, put together, but we really want to do Mysteries and Monsters. It's been sort of a natural progression for where we want to go with a big event.
Yeah, definitely. I think that would be great. And it's tough with these events being canceled. It's really, I don't think people who maybe aren't involved in planning and doing them, that it really has affected a lot, and how far ahead people are booking.
Yeah.
So, all right, here's the question. This was basically, he stole the words kind of out of my mouth here. I was going to ask you this anyway, but can you tell us about Area X? Do you have any experiences off camera? Did anyone else? Would love to hear about it. I wanted to talk about Area X. Area X was featured in On the Trail of Bigfoot. That's the North American Wood Ape Conservancy area that they studied. You obviously are one of the few people that spent time in there. It's funny, I rewatched that a couple days ago, and then it linked me to the Rob Lowe, and I watched their thing on it too, which is funny. But anyway, so yeah, what could you tell us about that?
So I can tell you something that viewers might want to check out. I do not have the timestamp in front of me, but there's a scene in the Area X episode 5 on the Trail of Bigfoot, where Adam and I are lost with Brian. I think it's referenced that we're back in the woods, we're lost. Daryl's scoping in a Bigfoot on his rifle. I say that we start hearing sounds between us and Daryl, and I turn the camera and I start walking in this direction toward the sounds. I've received 4 emails about this and 1 Facebook message, and Mark Matsky says he sees it too. Supposedly, there's something in this one shot that moves through the frame.
Wow.
So I don't know. I personally have watched it in frame by frame, and I can't see what they're talking about. So to me, I don't see anything. So take all of this with a grain of salt, obviously. And obviously I'm giving you a terrible idea of where this is in that episode. But I mean, it's in the section where we're lost with Brian and we turn around, and supposedly there's a moment there where the camera turns. And I know where the last lady sent me like still frames with red circles and everything.
The red circles.
I don't see anything there. But anyway, yeah. So X,
it's a big moment for you. I mean, in terms of your Bigfooting journey, so to speak, right?
Yeah. I'd say that's where I went from being like a skeptic, a very skeptical to almost on the verge of saying these things are real. I'm like right towing the line right now. I find that I am starting to sink back into skepticism, but I know in my heart, it's just because I haven't experienced anything. So I need to get back out in the woods and like, have the next big moment. I guess I need to see one. But anyway, yeah. So X, for just for listeners and viewers, X is it's a private property. It's in the middle of the Ouachita National Forest. It's 2.5 hour drive from any paved road. It's 9 miles, but it's a 2.5 hour drive. It is in the middle of a valley, and it's the most isolated place I've probably ever been. One of the most isolated places I've ever been. And we were there for, basically 2 nights, 1.5 days. I mean, a very short period of time. We were not in there very long. And in that time, like, we experienced all sorts of stuff that's not in the episode. You can watch episode 5 and like see all the stuff we did experience. It's pretty crazy. Like, there was eye shine and screams and all that. But we heard things that aren't mentioned in the episode. Is we heard we had walked out of the road at one point. We walked out down this dirt road. It was Brian, me, and Adam, and we were walking off up this road. And behind us, we started hearing a man and a woman talking. And we were, we're pretty far from camp. And actually, hold up. Okay, so what we did is let me restart. So
Yeah,
we're leaving the camp, and as soon as we left the camp, the first thing we heard was a wood knock. I mean, really clearly, like, we were walking off up the road, and something slapped a tree with a branch or something. And Brian radioed back to camp, and it wasn't Bob and it wasn't Kathy. And Daryl's off, a mile away in his camo, waiting in the woods somewhere, like he does. So so it wasn't any of them. So we kept walking. We went up. We shot some B-roll. I got some really cool footage of this little creek bed and stuff. And then we started back. And on the way back, we started hearing what sounded like a man and a woman talking. It was indecipherable what was being said, but it sounded like 2 voices, maybe in the road or around the next bend. And we're still like half a mile from camp. And so Brian immediately radios camp, and he says, "Are you guys talking?" And they said, "No, we're not talking." And we said, "Okay, can you guys start talking really loudly?" Because we wanted to know if maybe if it was them and they just kind of forgot that they had said something to each other. So they apparently were talking really loudly. We couldn't hear Bob and Kathy. So whatever was in the road ahead of us, it was two voices kind of talking back and forth. One other thing that happened around that exact same time that everyone else either tuned out or didn't hear is I very distinctly heard the Ohio Howl. And I heard it at a great distance. I mean, it had to have been a long ways off, but I heard it. And it might seem weird to say they maybe tuned it out, but once you're in there, you kind of have to tune stuff out, because you'd be shocked at how much you start. You'd be shocked at how much you activity you think you're hearing that's Bigfoot related, and you get to the point where, like, okay, you just got to like start tuning the stuff out and only really take in the stuff that's coming right at you. So it wasn't surprising to me that they didn't hear it, but I very distinctly heard it. So that was one thing, was that whole event with the talking. The other thing was earlier that same day, we had been on a walk, just kind of walking around the woods, and we were smelling this smell. We kept smelling it, and it was kind of like coming and going, almost like we were walking behind whatever this thing was, or it was staying just ahead of us or something. And it just kept coming and going. And Brian was like, it could be a bear. It doesn't really smell like a bear. It was kind of like a sweet, like a strangely like sweet smell. I'll tell you what, I went to the Cleveland Zoo last year with Tommy, and I smelled it again at the the gorilla enclosure.
That's amazing.
So what I experienced there, I experienced a year later, with the gorilla enclosure. And so there were tons of those little weird things, like the entire time we were there was one thing after the next. And you really do like get to the point where you just have to tune it all out, because you have to only start paying attention to the things that are coming right at you, or else you spend the entire time convinced that every single thing that happens is Bigfoot.
Yeah, especially in an area like that. That's what's so incredible about just that area. You've obviously been involved with them for quite a while, which is why they sort of let you in that area. I remember even just back in the day when we used to do Sasquatch, you had, I think, a couple of the guys on there at some point, and just hearing the story about that place. I don't think there's really anybody else doing that sort of long type of observation, sort of like what they did with gorillas in a sense in places like Africa. Just camping out, like having people posted the entire time of a whole summer, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I think that gets overlooked is they've been in there for like 20 years.
Right.
This isn't, even though we just have really started talking about Area X in the last 8 years, they've been going into that area for far longer than that. And some people in the group have been going into that area for longer than 20 years. So this is a place where they're very, they've been very committed in going in there and trying to have or trying to achieve their mission.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just incredible. You guys got access to that. I was so excited when that episode first came out, and very few people have had that privilege, but it's just so fascinating to hear about some of the things. I mean, when they say they've taken shots at things and some of the rocks, the rock collection, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, thanks for talking about that. That was probably my biggest question I was going to ask. Here's a good one from Mothman Historian. Who do you get to wear the monster suits for the recreations in your films?
I love this dude, man. He's no, for real. Like I've talked about this back when we were doing the Mothman at Point Pleasant stuff, but the Mothman Historian has been like the greatest. Especially on that movie, I haven't really gotten into the point where I know I'm going to end up pulling from the information he puts out there. But Mothman Historian is kind of like the keeper of the cryptid or the Mothman wiki, and the dude is like a next level genius, and he always comes to our talks and stuff at the Mothman Festival and asks cool questions. So yeah, let me think. So if we went back to the first time there was a Bigfoot suit in an STM movie, it was actually Aaron Gascon in a
good old Aaron.
Yeah, in a Bigfoot suit that looked. I mean, if you saw this thing in real life, it was worse than the worst Bigfoot Halloween suit you've ever seen. I mean, the worst. And we shot him in that for Boggy Creek Monster, but we shot him at a far distance most of the time, and we did it with that little Japanese toy camera, and it ended up looking really cool. So those quick cut-ins throughout Boggy Creek Monster, and there's not a lot of them, but I think they work. Like we watched it to do the commentary tracks last week, and I was surprised at how well those quick shots hold up even today. So Aaron Gascon was in the suit on that, and then for the next one, which was Invasion on Chestnut Ridge, that we had a monster suit. My dad is my dad is in a really bad like gorilla mask, and there's only I think like one shot over his shoulder or something, so you didn't really get it in that movie. And then Flatwoods Monster is like a huge, that was a huge metallic monster. There was no one in that. And then when we really got into the first movie that we did where it was costumed heavily was the Bray Road Beast. And that was Jason Yudice. So Jason's actually in the werewolf suit. And it's funny because Jason's only like maybe 5'7", 5'8". Like he's not very tall. And he's definitely not physically imposing, although he lifts weights and could probably, kick my rear end if he wanted to. But Jason and Santino get all the credit for that, because Santino did the reason that suit works is the eyes. Santino had watched some making of documentary. It was like, if we can do the eyes without lights, so that instead of being lights, which are just constantly on, there's no life to them. Santino got bicycle reflector tape, and then he taped them to just inside the mask. And what you end up having happen is when light hits them, all of a sudden you get that like you
The
know,
eye shine.
the eye shine
Yeah, that's
look. So
awesome.
it's living. So it's not lights which are just on perpetually. This was something else, and that's why I think those. I just have been looking at it recently, and like I think those Bray Road Beast recreation scenes work really well. So that was Jason in the suit, and then Momo obviously is the big one, and Momo and On the Trail of Bigfoot both are Ken Rose, my buddy Ken Rose playing Momo and the Bigfoot and On the Trail of Bigfoot. Ken is a stunt man and an actor, and he's done like professional wrestling and stuff. So he's got a body. He's built like a train, like he could run right through pretty much anyone. So he's tall. He's like 6'5", 6'6", and then he's just huge. Like he's a big dude.
Right.
So
you want to say just something about the because obviously I was there when we were filming that. The gloves and the actual costume itself, I thought it was really cool what you guys did with that.
Yeah, so again, like Santino gets the credit for that. The suit, the Momo suit was a ghillie suit, and then they would just comb it out, and it was painted. I don't know what Santino painted it with, but he painted it to kind of match, the descriptions of Momo, and then the feet are actually the same feet that were created for the On the Trail of Bigfoot costume. And then he had the mask was like where Santino really went all out. So Santino created this mask that pulled over, and then he had hands with 3 fingers. The hands were like latex gloves, and then he had built the mold over top of that, I think is how he did it.
Weren't they like Yoda gloves or something?
Was that what it was? No, I know for a fact that oh, you might be right.
I feel like somebody mentioned that when we were checking it out. I'm like,
I think they look like Yoda hands, but they're not Yoda. They weren't Yoda. They were like some sort of. But now that you say that, I do remember that he modded that out.
Right.
So he modded those gloves out. And then the other thing that was really insane about that is then the other thing was that he made these glasses. He took these glasses and then kitted them out with these LED lights. So no matter what, unlike Bray Road, we wanted realism. Momo, we did not want realism. Like we wanted it to look silly and hokey. So he's wearing those LED lights inside, so they're always on. But the one thing, I mean, we were filming in fairly cool weather because it was like up until the last weekend where we were filming out in Coshocton, and it was 80 degrees every day. Ken was wearing the suit pretty much all the time. When he would take the gloves off, the sweat would pour out of them. I mean, he was just in the suit, like sweating his life away. And he really had to be committed to the role, and he's done a great job. Like he had to do so much stuff in that movie, and he did a really great job.
Yeah, absolutely. I just remember being till 4 a.m. there in the woods of Ohio. It's getting cold, and he was in that suit the whole time. I'm like, wow, props to this guy. We're all, busting ourselves, getting lights and stuff set up, and this guy's just been in the suit for hours on end. I'm like, that definitely takes some patience, but yeah. Very cool. And the costumes have been awesome in a lot of the films, and obviously going forward, I can't wait to see what else you guys will come up with. But here's a couple more questions before we start wrapping up. I mean, this one's kind of self-explanatory, but Seth, have you had any Bigfoot type sightings in your area of Ohio?
Like myself, no, I haven't seen anything yet. You know what? I would love to see something here though. That's the thing. It's like, if I see it in Oklahoma or the Adirondacks or the Pacific Northwest, I'm still going to question Ohio. So right. If I could see it here, that's where I would love to see something, is here in Ohio.
Definitely. So this one, yeah, this is going to be a good one. I live basically in the Chestnut Ridge. Have any stories from there?
Yeah, I mean, I have all sorts of stories. I can tell one story that I don't think I've really told too much, that just happened while we were filming On the Trail of UFOs last October. And this is not cryptid related, but we were staying in this.
Oh, this is a good one.
Yeah, we were staying in this house that was apparently built in like the very early 1800s, maybe even the late 1700s. I mean, this place is ancient. It was a really creepy house. right at the base of the Chestnut Ridge. We were right, like right out our back door is beautiful, Chestnut Ridge, forested hill. And we were staying in this house for one night. Right when we were getting ready to go to bed. Let me describe the house too. It's like it sits on this farmland, so there's pasture land all around you. It was apparently one of the first settled areas in that part of Pennsylvania, and the house it feels like you're stepped back in time. Like there's one bedroom on the other end of the house, and then it's completely separated from where the rest of the living quarters are on the other side of the house, up on the second floor, where me and Adam and Zach and Jason were staying. Shannon got stuck alone on the other end of the house in the murder den, as we call it. But we were right before we went to bed, we were reading the guest book, and the guest book repeatedly mentioned people talking about how they had encountered ghosts in this house. And it didn't say, nothing was like really super scary. There was something about a woman standing in the living room, though, that creeped me out. Some guy said he woke up in the middle of the night and there was a woman standing in the middle of the living room just staring at him. That creeped me out. So we go to bed, and there were a lot of things that happened that night that were creepy, that were not connected with the ghost. There were these people we saw come out of our cellar who apparently were the groundskeepers, but we're not real sure why they were in our cellar. We had thousands of dollars worth of camera gear in this house, and these people were just like wandering in and out. So we didn't know what was going on. So 5 o'clock in the morning, I'm laying in bed, and I woke up at like 4:30, and I had to go to the bathroom. I came back up, and I was laying there. And you can hear the clock outside.
I was going to say, yeah. Is that the one on the street there? Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm laying in bed. It's 5 o'clock. I could not fall back asleep. I'm like, you know how I am. Like, I'm thinking about all the stuff I'm going to do that day, because we had to wake up, drive to New York City, and then shoot all afternoon in New York City with Ryan. So I'm laying in bed, and all of a sudden I very clearly hear footsteps come up the back deck, and these, clomp, 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 clomp. I hear the screen door, the rickety metal screen door, creak open. I hear the interior door open. I hear the metal door on the back porch slam shut, and then the door into our house slam shut. And then I hear clomp, 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 and like someone walk across the floor in the kitchen downstairs. And I jump out of bed, immediately run in and get Adam, and we're downstairs in 30 seconds, because we've got $20,000 worth of gear downstairs. Yeah. And there's no one in the house. And you couldn't get out of the house. Like, there wouldn't be a way to get out of the house in the time that we got downstairs without making a bunch of noise, like doors shut, like front door, if you got it. And all the doors were locked. That's the other thing. Like the back door to the porch was locked. Like, everything was locked. So that's my one, like, really creepy, weird story. There's one other one that we haven't really talked about since we made Invasion on Chestnut Ridge, and that's that one night Zach woke up in the middle of the night just absolutely freaking out, because he had a dream that he had looked out the window of the house we were staying in, and there was this old decrepit woman standing underneath the streetlight below, and she pointed up at him and started laughing. Oh, no. Like this really creepy laugh. And so I now believe that dream was about the Bell Witch. I'm dead serious. Like, I'm convinced, because other people connected with Heather Mosier had a nightmare about the Bell Witch that absolutely has Jason terrified now for 2 years. And so basically we're really excited to make the Bell Witch, because I'm convinced we're all going to be murdered by the Bell Witch.
That's going to be interesting to see.
So anyway, yeah, that's my one. That's really my only experiences on the Chestnut Ridge that are really weird.
No, I mean, it's a great encounter. How do you explain that? That's one of those things. I think a lot of people that even aren't into this subject or anything paranormal have experiences like that. That just, how do you explain something like that? I don't think there's a good way to do it. So I think we'll take 2 more questions here and wrap it up. But this one is just following back up to that question about the Bray Road stuff from Carrick of Crash Course Cryptozoology, saying, interesting answer. Do you think fads are prevalent throughout the more internet or armchair-based cryptozoology communities and websites?
Oh yeah. Yeah, and that's a good question. I think the prevalence of spooky podcasts more than anything is what drives what the latest fad is in cryptozoology. And I totally get it as someone who got into this because of podcasts, at least partially because of podcasts. So I think the biggest issue with this stuff, not issue, but I think what's really driving the fads are podcasts that are more about gaining hits and listens based on telling spooky stories. And I get the irony of a guy that makes movies about spooky stories saying this. I'm just telling you kind of what I think. And the reason I think that is because podcasts, like it or not, I think podcasts are becoming more popular than movies or TV, maybe combined. If you look at what the listens on a really popular podcast are, it's far higher than a really popular, television show or whatever about cryptids. So I think a lot of it is driven by podcasts. And then also just like there's a younger crowd getting into this, and they're more susceptible to believe hoaxes. They're more likely to fabricate or embellish their own stories as well. So
if you don't know the history of the subject too, I mean, a lot of us have obviously grown up in it and have read all the stuff starting from John Green to whatever back in the day. So you got to know the history in a way.
That's why we're in this situation where we are now with people buying the MK Davis massacre hoax all over again. I mean, it's been debunked how many times, and we're right back where we were 5 years ago. And I haven't been into this that long. So to see this stuff cycle over and over again is crazy.
Oh, it's so annoying, and I'm actually surprised we haven't gotten the usual torrential troll kind of comments that I have to block in the chat of people saying, "Oh, go check out this guy; he's got the truth." I think we addressed this with Meldrum and Coleman, because obviously those people are in on it with the government and blocking the existence and all the other lunacy that's going on. It's just absolutely crazy stuff. So he's just from Mothman Historian says, awesome, thanks Seth. As a fan of old horror movies that do makeup with cheap effects, I always idolize the guy in the monster suit and the ingenuity of the filmmakers that use them.
Yeah. I mean, we really have to constantly sing the praises of Santino. I mean, Santino Vitale is really the reason we've been able to grow. As I mean, the Mothman legacy, we don't have Chris Scalf. Like Chris Scalf's gone from the crew for now. So we're relying wholly on Santino, and I can't wait for people to start seeing like some of the stuff he's doing. The opening scene alone, which is sort of like a horror movie version of the opening of Terror in the Skies. I'm really excited for people to get a glimpse of what Santino's doing.
Absolutely. Let's close it out with this question from my buddy Stefan. Seth, would you say you are more interested in cryptozoology or ufology? Any thoughts about crossover theories involving certain cryptids, i.e. alien as a Bigfoot?
It's a good question. Cryptozoology, like I love ufology, and I think we're going to do more about UFO. I think we're going to do more on the trail of UFOs. But yeah, I come back to Bigfoot more than anything else, and Bigfoot I put in the camp of cryptozoology. So yeah, I come back to cryptozoology far more, and I personally don't really. Okay, so here's the thing. I love the stories that mix ufology and cryptozoology. I love them. I've made Invasion on Chestnut Ridge, so obviously I love them. I am open to those stories. We try to do as much of a mix of information in our, especially in like On the Trail of Bigfoot and On the Trail of UFOs. We give a voice to the people who consider those two subjects like intermingled. But yeah, personally, I don't necessarily see the two as being married.
Yeah, absolutely. And then Guy 15 says, I think you should make a podcast, Seth. Well, lucky for Guy 15, Seth does have the official Small Town Monsters podcast, which is Monsteropolis. And you can, I'll throw a link to that in the description as well.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And just like real quick, because like I saw Steven said something about this as a podcast. I'm not hammering on podcasts at all. Like my thing isn't that there's anything wrong with podcasts. I'm saying the reason what in my opinion is helping to define what is a fad these days in cryptozoology are podcasts, because I think the audience is larger, and that is where a lot of people are coming into podcasts. And again, I came into podcast. I got into all of this partially because of listening to podcasts. So there's nothing wrong with podcasts. In fact, it's the exact opposite. Like, it's great. Like there's people discovering podcasts or cryptids because of podcasts. I'm just saying, I think there's a trend right now in podcasts to get more listens by telling creepier and creepier stories. And that's a lot of people are sort of, that's what's defining maybe what the hot thing in cryptozoology is.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think if you just think about that audio visual capturing an audience, right? Something like a movie, at the end of the day, you want to have the person sit down and watch the movie. So they're not only listening with their ears, they're watching with their eyes. Whereas a podcast, you can be doing it at work. I mean, I know so many people that tell me, oh, you're into Bigfoot. I just listened to this podcast that talked about Bigfoot at work, kind of thing. So it's a little like, even this, you could put this interview on, and if you choose not to look at our beautiful faces, you could just listen to it and just kind of do it that way.
Yeah.
But anyway, well, thank you guys so much. There were some really great questions. Glad we got to talk about Area X, because I was going to ask that question anyway. I've been dying to somehow get into that area at some point, so fingers crossed. But Seth, yeah, so smalltownmonsters.com, that's where to get all your content. Do you want to say anything about upcoming projects or anything like that? Quick mention.
On the Trail of UFOs is our most recent thing. Alexander's in it quite a bit, especially episode 3 is like your big moment, and it's Chestnut Ridge. That's the Chestnut Ridge episode, actually.
And I'm going to be talking to Sean Forker about that incident on next week's show.
Awesome. So yeah, that's available on Amazon right now. And then later this year, we have the Mothman Legacy coming out. We have a truck roaring down the road outside. We have the Mark of the Bell Witch coming out in December. Mothman Legacy will be out around Halloween. And then we still have On the Trail of Lake Michigan Mothman, which got thrown around because of the coronavirus stuff. So we're trying to figure out how to slot that into our schedule for the year. But all that's still coming this year.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on, man. Appreciate talking to you as always. For everyone that's listening or watching this, just feel free to subscribe and check out, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, some of the other content. We have some great shows and some new ones coming up. As I mentioned, next week is with Sean Forker. He's a friend of both of ours, and we're going to talk about Pennsylvania Bigfoot, as well as the area of Pennsylvania that we've both investigated, and this UFO sighting that Seth kind of mentioned that was both of us are featured in that On the Trail of UFOs as well. So thank you guys so much again. Hope you guys have a great week, and we will see you next week. Have a good night, everyone.